The assault began exactly 60 minutes after the final warning, and it came from 17 directions simultaneously. Admiral Park had spent days studying the station layout and identifying weak points. His Marines knew every corridor and every guard rotation. They knew which doors would be locked and which walls were thin enough to breach when the attack came. The Dreth defenders barely had time to understand what was happening. Human assault shuttles punched through docking ports while breach pods cut through the hull in unexpected locations. Marines poured into the station with weapons raised and absolute precision in their movements. They did not shout or roar. They simply moved forward with terrifying efficiency. Overlord Krath watched his defenses collapse on the tactical display and screamed orders that no one followed. Half his officers had already fled. The other half were too paralyzed with fear to respond. "Seal the detention blocks," he shouted. "If we still have the hostages, we still have leverage." But his communications officer shook her head with despair. "The humans have already reached detention block 7, she reported. They knew exactly where to go. Krath stared at her with dawning horror. They had known everything. From the very beginning, the humans had known everything in the corridors of Karveth Station. Keth led Ambassador Yoon through maintenance tunnels and forgotten passageways. He knew this station better than most because he had spent years working in its forgotten corners. "There is an emergency airlock 3 levels down," he whispered. "The humans will be watching for escape pods, but they might miss a maintenance access." Yoon grabbed his arm and stopped him. "We cannot leave the other hostages," she said firmly. Keth stared at her with disbelief. "The humans are here for you," he protested. "They will not stop the assault just because we ask." "I am not asking them to stop," Yoon replied. "I am asking you to help me free the others before we leave." Keth felt fear clawing at his chest. The station was falling apart around them, and human soldiers were everywhere. Every instinct told him to run and save himself. But Yoon was looking at him with complete faith. She believed he would do the right thing. She believed in him. "The Kethvari merchant is being held 2 levels up," he said finally. "The Mirathi scientists are in Research Wing 3. Yoon squeezed his arm with gratitude. "Show me." They moved through the station while chaos erupted around them. Human Marines pushed deeper into Dreth territory with relentless precision. They cleared rooms and secured corridors. They treated surrendering enemies with surprising restraint. One Dreth officer dropped his weapon and raised his hands. The human Marine who found him did not shoot. Instead, she secured his wrists and moved him to a holding area. "Why do you not kill us?" the officer asked with genuine confusion. "We are your enemies." The Marine looked at him with expression he could not read. "You are not soldiers," she said simply. "You are criminals who made bad choices, and killing you serves no purpose." She moved on to the next room, and the Dreth officer stared after her in stunned silence on the command deck of the Resolute. Admiral Park received constant updates from his ground teams. "Delta Team has secured the ambassador's original cell," an officer reported. "She was not there, but we found evidence she left recently." "Track her," Park ordered. "She cannot have gone far." Another officer looked up from her console. "Sir, we are receiving reports of secondary rescue operations. Someone is freeing hostages throughout the station." Park frowned at this unexpected information. "Our teams?" "Negative, sir," the officer replied. "The rescues are happening ahead of our advance." Understanding dawned in Park's expression. "The ambassador is doing it herself," he said with something like pride. "She is freeing them." Keth and Yoon reached the research wing where 3 Mirathi scientists huddled in their cells. The guards had already fled, and the doors were locked with electronic seals. Keth worked on the access panel, while Yoon spoke to the frightened prisoners. "Help is coming," she told them through the barrier. "You will be safe soon." One of the scientists, an elderly female with faded blue scales, pressed her hand against the transparent door. Why would you risk yourself for us? She asked. Your people have come for you, and you should run to safety. Yoon smiled despite her exhaustion. Because no one deserves to be left behind, she said. And because helping others is what humans do. The door slid open, and the scientists stumbled out with tears streaming down their faces. They had been held captive for months, and they had given up hope. Now a battered human woman and a young Dreth guard were leading them to freedom in the command center of Karveth Station. Overlord Krath made his final move. He abandoned his officers and his people and fled toward his personal hangar. His ship was fast and it was well armed. If he could reach open space, he could escape and rebuild. He could make the humans pay for humiliating him. He burst into the hangar and froze. Human destroyer hung in the space beyond the hangar doors. It had positioned itself perfectly to block his escape. Krath ran to his ship anyway. He powered up the engines and launched into space. For one brief moment, he thought he might make it. Then the destroyer fired a precision shot that disabled his engines without destroying the ship. Krath drifted helplessly as human shuttles approached. Marines breached his airlock and stormed the board. He reached for his weapon and a human soldier kicked it from his hand. Overlord Krath. The Marine commander said calmly, "You are under arrest for kidnapping, terrorism, and crimes against sapient beings. Kill me then." Krath snarled. "I know you want revenge." The Marine shook his head. "We do not want revenge," he replied. "We want justice, and justice requires a trial." Krath was dragged away in restraints, and he screamed curses that no one acknowledged. Back on the station, the assault concluded with remarkable efficiency. Human Marines secured the command center and engineering sections. They found weapons caches and criminal records and evidence of crimes spanning decades. They also found over 200 Dreth personnel who surrendered without resistance. The final report reached Admiral Park 90 minutes after the assault began. Ambassador Yoon Seon had been recovered. 17 other hostages had been freed. Krath had been captured alive. Human casualties numbered 14 dead and 37 wounded. Park closed his eyes and allowed himself one moment of grief. Those 14 Marines had volunteered knowing the risks. They had died to save one diplomat and 17 strangers. Their sacrifice was not calculated or measured against expected returns. It was simply what humans did for each other. Counselor Veth Ann watched the aftermath from her observation post and felt her understanding of humans shift forever. She had studied them for decades. She had written papers and given lectures. She had thought she understood, but seeing them now collecting their fallen comrades with solemn reverence, she realized the truth. Humans were not remarkable because of their technology or their tactics. They were remarkable because they genuinely cared about each individual life. Even now, with victory secured, they were treating Dreth wounded alongside their own. They were feeding prisoners who had been their enemies moments before. They were comforting traumatized hostages from species they had never met. "They are extraordinary," she whispered. Her aide looked at her with confusion. "They are terrifying," he countered. Vethan shook her head slowly. "They are both," she said, "and that is what makes them unique." In a quiet corner of the station, Ambassador Yoon reunited with the rescue teams that had come for her. She was battered and exhausted, but she stood straight and proud. Beside her stood a young Dreth named Kath, who had chosen courage over fear. "This man saved my life," Yoon told the Marine commander. "He turned against his own people to help me and the other hostages." The commander studied Kath with unreadable expression. "What do you want to happen to him?" she asked. Yoon did not hesitate. "I want him protected," she said firmly. "He has a daughter, and he deserves a chance to build a new life." The commander nodded slowly. "Then that is what will happen," she said. Kath stared at the humans surrounding him with complete bewilderment. He had betrayed his people and helped their enemy. By every law of the Dreth Syndicate, he deserved death, but the humans were offering him protection. They were offering him a future. "I do not understand," He whispered. Yoon placed her hand on his shoulder and smiled. You chose to do what was right, she said. That makes you one of us now. The human fleet crossed into Dreth territory on the 9th day, and they did not slow down. Admiral Park Min-jin stood on the bridge of the command ship, resolute, and watched tactical displays update in real time. Every ship in his fleet knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they would do when they arrived. Admiral, we are receiving transmissions from the Dreth, his communications officer reported. They are demanding we halt and negotiate. Park did not even glance at the officer. No response. He said calmly, maintain course and speed. The fleet pushed deeper into hostile space, and the Dreth scrambled to mounted defense. Krath had called in every favor and every ally his organization possessed. Pirate clans and mercenary groups rallied to his banner with promises of wealth and power. By the time the human fleet reached the Karveth system, Krath had assembled over 200 ships. It should have been enough to give the humans pause. It was not. The human fleet dropped out of faster than light travel in perfect formation around Karveth Station. They surrounded the massive fortress in every direction and left no avenue of escape. Then they stopped and waited. Krath watched the human positions from his command center with growing terror. He had expected aggression and violence and desperate attacks. Instead, the humans simply sat there in absolute stillness. Open a channel, Krath ordered. I want to speak to their commander. The channel opened, and Krath found himself facing a human man with gray hair and cold eyes. I am Overlord Krath of the Dreth Syndicate, he began. You have entered sovereign territory without permission, and I demand. No. Admiral Park interrupted. Krath blinked in confusion. What? No. Park repeated. You do not get to make demands, and you do not get to negotiate. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight like mountains. You took one of our people, he continued. You hurt her, and you threatened to kill her. Park leaned forward slightly. We are here to take her back. I have 200 ships. Krath sputtered. I have hostages from other species, and I have defenses that have never been breached. Park's expression did not change. You have nothing, he said simply. Then he ended the transmission. Hours passed, and the human fleet remained motionless. They did not fire a single shot. They did not issue any demands. They simply waited while the Dreth defenders grew increasingly nervous. Counselor Vethen observed from a safe distance and documented everything for her people. They are breaking them without combat, she whispered to her recorder. The Dreth have faced enemies before, but they have never faced patience like this. She watched as Dreth ships began to drift out of formation. Captains who had joined Krath for profit were reconsidering their choices. Some of them quietly powered down weapons and surrendered. Others simply fled into the darkness between stars. By the end of the first day, Krath had lost 40 ships without the humans firing a single weapon. Inside Karveth Station, the atmosphere grew desperate. Guards argued with officers, and officers argued with each other. Rumors spread that the humans had already infiltrated the station, that they were watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ambassador Yoon heard the chaos outside her cell and understood what was happening. The humans were letting fear do their work for them. They were giving Krath's organization time to tear itself apart. Keth came to her cell that night with food, and his hands were shaking. They say the humans have ships that can destroy planets, he whispered. They say human soldiers feel no pain and cannot be killed. Yoon almost laughed despite her situation. None of that is true, she said gently. Humans are fragile beings who feel everything. Then why is everyone so afraid? Keth asked. Yoon considered the question carefully. Because we never give up, she said finally. Other species calculate odds and weigh costs against benefits. She met his eyes with quiet intensity. Humans look at someone they care about and find a way no matter what. Keth stared at her with growing confusion. Your government sent hundreds of ships across the galaxy for one person, He said, "Do they truly value you so much? They would do the same for anyone." Yoon replied, "That is what we do." Keth fell silent, and Yoon could see him processing information that contradicted everything he had been taught on the bridge of the resolute Admiral Park received updates from intelligence operatives inside the station. Ambassador Yoon is alive and her condition is stable. His intelligence officer reported, "We have confirmed her location in Detention Block 7. What about the other hostages?" Park asked. 17 individuals from 6 different species. The officer replied, "They are being held in various locations throughout the station." Park nodded slowly. "We will rescue them all." His tactical officer looked up with surprise. "Sir, our mission is to recover Ambassador Yoon," she said carefully. "The other hostages are not our responsibility." Park turned to face her with an expression that brooked no argument. "They are being held by people who took one of ours," he said. "That makes them our responsibility." The tactical officer nodded and returned to her work. Overlord Krath made one final attempt to salvage the situation. He appeared on every broadcast channel with Ambassador Yoon beside him. Her face was battered, and dried blood stained her diplomatic uniform. Krath held a weapon to her head, and his voice carried a desperate edge. "If you do not withdraw immediately, I will execute this human," he declared. "Your fleet may destroy this station, but your ambassador will die first." He waited for a response, and the silence stretched into eternity. Then a single message appeared on his personal screen. It came from the human fleet, and it contained only 2 sentences. "We know exactly where she is, and we know exactly where you are. You have 1 hour to reconsider your entire life." Krath read the message 3 times and felt something he had not experienced in decades, pure, unfiltered fear. He looked at the human woman kneeling beside him and saw no fear in her eyes. She was smiling on the observer ships. Representatives from a dozen species watched the confrontation with breathless attention. The Kethvari ambassador turned to Counselor Vethan with obvious confusion. "Why do the humans not simply attack?" he asked. "They have overwhelming force, and surely they must want to end this quickly." Vethan shook her head slowly. "They are not just trying to rescue their ambassador," she said. "They are sending a message to everyone watching." She gestured at the tactical display showing the silent human fleet. "They want the galaxy to understand what happens when someone threatens their people." The Kethvari ambassador considered this for a long moment. "And what is that message exactly?" he asked. Vethan turned to face him with something like awe in her expression. "That there is no distance they will not cross," she said quietly. "No enemy they will not face, and no price they will not pay." She paused, and her scales rippled with unease. "The message is simple," she continued. "Do not touch what belongs to humanity, because they will come for you." Inside Carveth Station, the hour was almost over. Keth stood outside Ambassador Yoon's cell and made the most important decision of his young life. He thought about his daughter Vila. He thought about the kind human woman who had treated him with dignity. He thought about the fleet waiting outside that would burn this station to ash. Then he opened the cell door. "Come with me," he said to Yoon. "I know a way out." Yoon looked at him with surprise that quickly turned to gratitude. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you helping me?" Keth thought about the question for a long moment. "Because you reminded me that I have a choice," he said. "Because I want my daughter to grow up knowing I did something good." He offered his hand and Yoon took it together. They stepped into the corridor, and the final hour began counting down. The Galactic Council chamber fell silent as Ambassador Yoon Se-han entered through the massive doors. She walked slowly but steadily, with bruises still visible on her face and bandages wrapped around her wrists. She had refused medical treatment until she could deliver this message personally. Representatives from 47 species watched her approach the central podium. Many of them had expected demands for punishment and calls for sanctions against anyone who had ever dealt with the Dreth Syndicate. They expected anger and threats and the beginning of human expansion by force. They had prepared speeches of their own, defending their neutrality and urging restraint. Yoon reached the podium and surveyed the assembled delegates. Then she began to speak 11 days ago. I was taken from neutral ground by criminals who believed they understood how the galaxy works. She said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the massive chamber. They believed that governments would calculate the cost of my rescue against the value of my life, and they believed the math would not favor me. She paused and let the words settle. They were wrong. The chamber remained silent as Yoon continued. My government sent 400 warships across the galaxy to bring me home, but this message is not about our military strength. She looked around the chamber with eyes that held no anger. This message is about who we are. Yoon touched the bandages on her wrist, and her voice softened. During my captivity, I met a young Dreth guard named Keth, who had joined the syndicate because his family owed debts. He was not evil, and he was not cruel. He was a father who had made desperate choices to survive. The delegates shifted uncomfortably. This was not the speech they had expected. I could have seen Keth as my enemy. Yoon continued. I could have hated him for being part of the organization that hurt me. Instead, I asked about his daughter, and I treated him like a person. She smiled, and the expression transformed her battered face. When the time came, he chose to help me, and together we freed 17 hostages from 6 different species. He is here today under human protection, and he will never face punishment for saving lives. A murmur ran through the chamber, and Yoon let it fade before she spoke again. The galaxy has watched our response to this crisis, and many of you have concluded that humanity is dangerous. She said, you have seen our ships and our soldiers and our terrifying efficiency. You have wondered what we might do to species that oppose us. Yoon stepped forward, and her voice grew firm. Let me tell you exactly what we will do. The chamber tensed with anticipation. We will trade with you fairly. Yoon said, we will honor our agreements, even when breaking them would benefit us. We will defend our people with everything we have, and we will extend that same protection to our friends. She spread her hands in a gesture of openness. We did not come to the stars to conquer. She declared, we came to find family. Counselor Vethan of the Mirathi Collective listened with growing understanding. She had spent 50 years studying humans, and only now did she grasp the truth. Humans were not dangerous because of their warships. They were dangerous because they meant every word. When they said they would protect their people, they would move heaven and earth to do so. When they said they wanted friendship, they would sacrifice everything to prove it. That combination of absolute sincerity and absolute commitment was more powerful than any weapon. Yoon concluded her speech with words that would echo across the galaxy for generations. The Dreth Syndicate targeted a human diplomat and discovered what happens when you threaten our family, she said. But here is what I want you to understand. She looked directly at the assembled delegates with fierce intensity. Every species in this chamber could be our family if you choose. We will protect you like we protect our own. We will fight for you and sacrifice for you and never abandon you. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. All you have to do is ask. The chamber erupted and whispered discussions as delegates processed what they had heard. Some were skeptical and wondered if this was simply clever diplomacy. Others remembered small kindnesses that humans had shown them over the years. They remembered debts forgiven and favors granted without expectation of return. They remember being treated as equals when other species had looked down on them. The Kethvari delegate rose and spoke in his musical voice. The Kethvari Consortium wishes to formalize a mutual defense treaty with humanity. He announced. A ripple of shock ran through the chamber. The Kethvari had never allied with anyone in their entire history. Other delegates began to stand. The Mirathi offered scientific partnerships. The Velanathi proposed trade agreements. Even species that had viewed humans with suspicion found themselves reconsidering. Within hours, the political landscape of the galaxy had shifted forever. In the weeks that followed, the Dreth Syndicate collapsed completely. Members surrendered to authorities or fled to the farthest reaches of known space. Criminal organizations that had operated openly for centuries suddenly became very quiet. They had seen what humans did to those who threatened their people. They had no desire to experience it themselves. Overlord Krath stood trial before a galactic tribunal and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He spent his remaining years in a comfortable cell, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. He had followed the same pattern that had worked for centuries. He had taken a hostage and made demands. The only difference was that he had chosen a human, and that difference had destroyed everything he had built. 3 months after her rescue, Ambassador Yoon visited a human refugee center on the colony world of New Seoul. She walked through bright hallways decorated with children's artwork and found herself in a small classroom. There sat Keth surrounded by human and alien children, learning to read basic English. His daughter Vela played in a corner with a young human girl who was teaching her to build towers from colored blocks. Keth looked up as Yoon entered, and his face lit with genuine joy. "Ambassador," he said, and rose to greet her. "Please call me Sehan," she replied with a warm smile. They walked together through the center, and Keth showed her the small apartment where he and Vela now lived. It was modest but clean and filled with toys and books and signs of a happy life. "I still do not fully understand," Keth admitted. "Your people should hate me for what I was part of, and instead they have given me a home." Yoon considered the question carefully. "Do you remember what I told you in my cell?" she asked. "That there is good in everyone." Keth nodded slowly. "You showed that good when it mattered most." Yoon continued. "You chose compassion over fear, and now you have a chance to build a life worthy of your daughter." She placed her hand on his arm with gentle reassurance. "That is all anyone can ask, and that is all we will ever require." Keth's eyes glistened with emotion. He could not hide. "How can I ever repay what you have given me?" he asked. Yoon smiled and nodded toward the classroom where Vela was laughing with her new friend. "Raise her to be kind," she said simply. "Teach her that strangers can become family. Let her grow up knowing that the galaxy is bigger than fear and hatred." She met his eyes with quiet intensity. "That is how you repay us." Later that day, Ambassador Yoon returned to her office and found a report waiting on her desk. It was a classified document from the Galactic Council Intelligence Division. The report contained a new species classification that had been created specifically for humans. It read as follows: Homo sapiens, protective, collective, species with extreme response profile and unlimited loyalty parameters. And at the bottom, someone had added a handwritten note. Advisory to all member species. Do not target their people and do not threaten their friends. They remember and they always come. Yoon read the note and laughed softly. It was perhaps the most accurate assessment of humanity she had ever seen. They did remember. They did always come, and now the entire galaxy understood exactly what that meant. Outside her window, the stars stretched endlessly into the darkness. Somewhere out there, other species were making decisions about their future. Some would choose fear and isolation. Others would choose partnership and trust. Humanity would welcome all who reached out with open hands. They would protect those who needed protection. They would fight for those who could not fight for themselves, and they would never ever abandon their own. That was the promise humans made to the universe. That was the terrifying, beautiful truth that Overlord Krath had discovered too late. Humanity was coming to the stars, not as conquerors, but as family, and once you belong to them, you belong forever. Ambassador Yoon Sahan stepped off the shuttle and onto the polished floors of Varanthos, prime with the quiet confidence that came from years of diplomatic service. The massive orbital station hung between 3 star systems and served as neutral ground for dozens of species who would never trust each other anywhere else. Yoon had visited many times before, and she always found the place both beautiful and exhausting. Ambassador, the HFY delegation is waiting in the eastern wing, her aide Junho said as he walked beside her. They seem eager to discuss the mining rights. Yoon nodded and adjusted her formal jacket. The negotiations were routine and she expected them to conclude within a few days. Her team was small because Varanthos Prime was considered the safest place in the galaxy. No species had ever violated its neutrality in over 400 years. The eastern wing sparkled with crystalline architecture that the Mirathi had designed centuries ago. Yoon passed diplomats from a dozen worlds, and each one gave her polite acknowledgement. Humans were still newcomers to galactic politics, but they had earned a reputation for fairness and creative problem-solving. The HFY delegation leader, a tall being with silver scales and 4 arms, rose to greet her. Ambassador Yoon, we are honored by your presence. Councillor Vethros said with a formal bow. The honor is mine. Yoon replied and returned the gesture. They spent the afternoon discussing trade routes and resource sharing, and by evening, Yoon felt optimistic about reaching an agreement. The formal dinner that followed was a celebration of progress. Representatives from 5 species gathered in a grand hall filled with floating lights and music that shifted to accommodate different hearing ranges. Yoon sat at the head table and listened to Vethros tell stories about ancient HFY explorers. She laughed at the right moments and asked thoughtful questions, and everything felt perfectly normal. Then the lights went out. Yoon heard screaming before her eyes adjusted to the darkness. Flashes of weapon fire lit up the hall in sharp bursts of blue and green. She felt Junho grab her arm and pull her toward the floor. Stay down, he whispered urgently, but there were too many attackers, and they moved with practiced precision. Yoon watched in horror as masked figures cut through the security personnel like they were nothing. These were not random criminals. They knew exactly what they were doing. A massive hand grabbed Yoon by the collar and lifted her off the ground. She found herself staring into a face covered by a black mask with glowing red eye pieces. The human ambassador, a rough voice said with satisfaction. You will come with us. Junho tried to intervene, and one of the attackers struck him down without hesitation. Yoon screamed his name, but rough hands dragged her away from the chaos. The last thing she saw, before they forced a hood over her head, was the bodies of her aides lying motionless on the beautiful crystalline floor. The attackers moved her through corridors that grew darker and colder. She heard the sound of an airlock cycling and felt the familiar lurch of a ship detaching from a station. Then came the cold silence of space travel. Hours passed, or maybe days, because Yoon lost track of time in the darkness. When they finally removed the hood, she found herself in a metal cell with no windows and a single harsh light overhead. A figure stood before her, and this one wore no mask. He was Dreth, a species known throughout the galaxy for their criminal enterprises and brutal methods. His gray skin was covered in ritual scars, and his yellow eyes studied her with cruel amusement. I am Overlord Krath, he said slowly. And you, Ambassador, are now the property of the Dreth Syndicate. Yoon forced herself to stand straight despite her fear. Varanthos Prime is neutral ground, she said firmly. What you have done will turn every species against you. Krath laughed, and the sound echoed off the metal walls. Other species will do nothing because they never do, he replied. We have taken diplomats before, and governments always negotiate quietly to avoid embarrassment. He stepped closer, and Yoon refused to back away. Your people will pay whatever we demand, or we will send you back to them in pieces, he continued. Humanity is new here, and you do not understand how things work. Yoon said nothing because she knew that arguing would accomplish nothing, but deep inside she felt something that Krath could not see. It was not hope exactly, but rather certainty. Krath was wrong about humans. He was catastrophically wrong. The broadcast went out across every major communication network in the galaxy. Overlord Krath stood before a camera with Yoon kneeling beside him. Her face bruised, but her eyes defiant. Humanity has expanded too far and too fast. Krath declared, "You will withdraw from the Varan, Keth, and Solari systems within 30 standard days, or Ambassador Yoon Se-han will die." He smiled at the camera. With absolute confidence, this is not a negotiation, but rather a statement of terms. The broadcast ended, and the galaxy waited to see what the humans would do on Earth. The emergency alert reached United Earth Command at precisely 347 hours. Admiral Park Min-jun was pulled from sleep by an aide who looked pale with shock. "Sir, one of our ambassadors has been taken," the aide said. "The Dreth Syndicate is claiming responsibility." Park read the report in silence, and his expression grew harder with each line. When he finished, he looked up at his aide and spoke in a voice that carried no emotion. "Wake everyone," he said quietly, and I mean everyone. Within the hour, humanity moved as one. The Third Fleet changed course from training exercises and set heading for the Dreth border. Intelligence networks activated assets that had been dormant for years. Civilian transport companies volunteered their ships for supply runs. Politicians, who had spent months arguing over minor issues, suddenly found complete agreement. There was no debate about whether to respond. There was only debate about how quickly they could move across the galaxy. Other species watched with confusion. The Mirathi counselor Vethan studied the human response from her observation post and felt a chill run down her spine. She had spent 40 years analyzing human behavior, and she had never seen anything like this. "They are not negotiating," her aide observed. "They are not even talking to the Dreth." Vethan nodded slowly as understanding dawned. "They do not intend to negotiate," she whispered. "They intend to demonstrate." On the Dreth Fortress Station Karveth, Overlord Krath received reports of human fleet movements and frowned. This was not how things were supposed to work. Other species always talked first and threatened second. They always valued stability over individual lives. Why were the humans moving warships before they even responded to his demands? One of his lieutenants approached with visible nervousness. "Overlord, should we open communication channels?" he asked. "Perhaps they wish to begin negotiations." Krath shook his head dismissively. "Let them come," he said with forced confidence. "We have defenses and we have hostages, and we have done this many times before." But late that night, when Krath was alone, he stared at the tactical displays showing human fleet positions, and he felt the first whisper of doubt. Something was different about these humans. Something he had failed to account for in her. Cell Ambassador Yoon heard guards talking in hushed voices about ships and fleets and movements. She could not understand their language, but she recognized fear when she heard it. Yoon closed her eyes and allowed herself a small smile. They were coming for her. She had never doubted it for a moment. Counselor Veth Ann of the Mirathi Collective had studied humans for nearly half a century, and she thought she understood them. She had written papers about their strange customs and their peculiar attachment to individual lives. She had observed their tendency to form bonds with other species, and even with animals and machines. But watching them now, she realized she had understood nothing at all. How many ships? She asked her aide. 417 warships at last count, he replied, plus another 200 support vessels, and the number is still growing. Vethan stared at the display showing human fleet positions and felt her scales tighten. With unease, the Third Fleet had covered a distance in 3 days that should have taken 2 weeks. They had burned through fuel reserves that would take months to replace. They had pushed their engines beyond recommended safety limits. All of this for one person. The Kethvari are asking if we will join a diplomatic coalition. Her aide continued. They want to negotiate with the Dreth on humanity's behalf. Vethan shook her head slowly. The humans do not want negotiators, she said quietly. Look at how they move and tell me they want to talk. Her aide studied the Tactical display and understanding slowly crept across his features. The human fleet was not positioning for negotiation. They were positioning for war on Earth. The response continued to build with a speed that terrified those who watched. Admiral Park coordinated movements from United Earth Command while politicians worked to gather every scrap of intelligence about Dreth operations. Private citizens organized supply drives and medical preparation. Veterans who had retired decades ago called their former units and asked how they could help. A reporter asked the Secretary General why humanity was responding with such overwhelming force over a single diplomat. The Secretary General, an elderly woman named Chen Liwei, looked at the reporter with genuine confusion. "She is one of us," she said simply. "What else would we do?" The reporter tried to explain that other species typically calculated the cost of rescue against the value of the hostage. Chen Liwei listened patiently and then responded with words that would be repeated across the galaxy for generations. "We do not calculate the worth of our people," she said. "They are not numbers on a balance sheet, and they are not acceptable losses." She paused, and her eyes grew hard. "The Dreth have taken someone we swore to protect, and we will get her back. What if the cost is too high?" The reporter pressed. Chen Liwei smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "There is no cost too high," she replied. "That is what makes us human." Across the galaxy, intelligence networks that humans had built over decades activated for a single purpose. Agents who had been planted for economic monitoring suddenly shifted to gathering military information. Trade partners who had grown wealthy from human commerce offered whatever they knew about Dreth operations. Individuals from a dozen species came forward with information because humans had once shown them kindness. A Kethvari merchant provided detailed scans of Dreth shipping routes because a human captain had once saved his crew from pirates. Murat the engineer shared classified defense codes because humans had funded her research when no one else would. A young Velani information broker handed over everything he knew because a human teacher had once believed in him when his own people had given up. Information flowed toward humanity like water finding cracks in stone. Within 5 days they knew the exact location of Ambassador Yoon's cell. They knew the patrol schedules of every guard. They knew the weak points in Karveth Station's defenses. They knew which officers were loyal to Krath and which ones were simply afraid. Overlord Krath received reports of these intelligence breaches and grew increasingly disturbed. His organization had operated for centuries without any serious opposition. They had taken hostages from a dozen species, and every single time the pattern was the same. Governments would protest publicly. While negotiating privately, they would pay ransoms or make concessions in life. Would continue, but humans were not following the pattern. They were not talking. They were not negotiating. They were simply moving closer with hundreds of warships. An absolute silence. Send another broadcast. Krath ordered his communications officer. Remind them what happens to hostages when demands are not met. The officer hesitated, and Krath saw fear in his eyes. Overlord, perhaps we should consider releasing the human, he suggested carefully. Their response seems disproportionate, and we have already made our point. Krath struck him across the face, and the officer fell to the floor. Will you not surrender to newcomers? Krath snarled. They will learn to fear us like everyone else. But even as he spoke the words, Krath felt doubt gnawing at his confidence. The humans were not afraid. They were angry. In her cell, Ambassador Yoon had begun to notice changes in her. Captors, the guards who brought her food, avoided eye contact. The officers who had once mocked her now spoke in whispers. One young Dreth named Keth seemed particularly affected. He was barely an adult by his species standards, and Yoon could see that he had not chosen this life willingly. Why did you join the syndicate? She asked him one day. Keth looked around nervously before answering. My family owed debts, he said quietly. This was the only way to pay them. You nodded with understanding rather than judgment. "Do you have children?" she asked. Keth's eyes widened with surprise. No hostage had ever asked about his life before. A daughter. He admitted, "She is 3 years old." "What is her name?" "Vila." Yoon smiled gently, despite her bruises and exhaustion. "That is a beautiful name," she said. "You must miss her." Keth stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. He had been taught that humans were aggressive expansionists who threatened Dreth interests. He had been told they were cold and calculating like machines. But this woman with her broken lip and blackened eye was asking about his daughter. She was treating him like a person. "Why are you being kind to me?" he asked. Yoon considered the question carefully. "Because cruelty solves nothing," she said finally. "And because I believe there is good in everyone, even when circumstances make it hard to show." Keth said nothing, but Yoon saw something shift. In his expression, a seed had been planted. Whether it would grow remained to be seen. The human fleet reached the edge of Dreth territory on the 7th day. They did not cross the border immediately. Instead, they stopped and waited. 400 warships hung in the void like predators watching prey. They broadcast no demands. They made no threats. They simply existed in perfect formation and terrifying silence. Other species sent observer vessels to watch what would happen next. The Kethvari sent a diplomatic cruiser. The Marathi sent a research vessel. Even the reclusive Valanathi emerged from their isolation to witness what was about to unfold. Counselor Vethan watched from her ship and felt her scales grow cold. "They are waiting," her aide observed. But for what? Vethan understood, and the understanding frightened her. "They are giving the Dreth time to be afraid," she said. "They want them to imagine what is coming." On Karveth Station, Overlord Krath stared at the tactical display showing the human fleet and felt his confidence crumbling. He had expected negotiations by now. He had expected threats and counteroffers and the familiar dance of galactic politics. Instead, he faced silence from hundreds of warships that simply waited and watched and gave him time to understand exactly how badly he had miscalculated. Krath turned to his advisors with desperation creeping into his voice. "What do they want?" he demanded. "Why will they not speak to us?" No one had an answer. The humans had made their message clear without saying a word. They were coming for their ambassador, and nothing in the galaxy would stop them.